Alrighty, y'all, we are in the midst of a JJK break week, but don't worry, we're going to make it through. And in the meantime, I'm going to answer some more of y'all's questions. So let's get into it, but spoilers if you're not caught up through chapter 261. All right, so let's kick things off with a couple of Cash App questions here from Isaac, Jojo, and Cameron. And starting at the top, could Kinjaku have made his body a cursed object? I certainly think it's possible, right? Crazier things have happened, and Kinjaku, after all, is the originator of that. He invented it, right? He's the one that showed Sukuna how to do it. He's the one who showed all of the culling game sorcerers how to do it. It stands to reason that he might have some contingency or backup plans, right? Maybe one of which was turning himself into a cursed object. Now, what would that mean? Well, let's kind of move on down to this second question here on could he take over the Gojo body after Yuta's 5 minutes are done, right? And I think it's possible. I think that window exists because there's so many question marks about what exactly is going to happen after those 5 minutes. So could some nuance of Kinjaku's technique, some contingency he had in place give him room to swoop in? I think it's possible. I think it's harder for him to have planned that because I don't think he could have known that Yuta was going to do that, because then that means like he planned to specifically lose to Yuta, which I'm not saying is impossible, but if Kinjaku comes back, I would reckon that it would be a different way than this specifically. Jojo also asked me on Discord to kind of follow up to this on what do I think Kinjaku would do if this happened. And that's tough because, you know, he certainly would be in a very powerful position, but he did already give the authority to start the merger to Sukuna. So he has to wait for Sukuna to do that. So I don't think he would like betray Sukuna or anything like that yet, because he ultimately wants that merger to happen. And since that power lies in Sukuna/Megami's hands, he's probably going to be aligned with Sukuna/Megami until the merger actually happens. Then at that point, who knows? He seems very just like wants to see what will happen. So I don't know if he'll like necessarily have any vendettas per se, but yeah, I think he just ultimately wants to make sure that that merger happens. And then finally for this last one, did Sukuna use World Cutting Slash without his hand sign via a binding vow against Yuta? And I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever get clarity on this, but for my money, that definitely was the World Cutting Slash. Just the fact that it did end up completely bisecting Akotsu, the way they've talked about the slash since then, the fact that we got the chance on screen. I know a lot of people argue that this was just an empowered dismantle, but I don't think so. I think it was the World Cutting Slash, but that does pose some interesting questions on how did Sukuna manage to do that when his arms were tied and his other arms were destroyed. So I think the best guess is it really just happened off panel at some point between when Rika let go, perhaps to get out of the way of the Jacob's Ladder or whatever the case may be. But Sukuna did use the Inmiten and just did do the World Cutting Slash normally. Now, is it possible he used a binding vow? Sure. And if that were the case, I would hope that we would get some clarity in a flashback or something. But absent of that, I just assume it was the normal World Cutting Slash under normal conditions, and we just didn't actually get to see him do the hand sign. Next up, we got these questions from Nikki, and let me move out of the way for anybody that wants to pause and read it. But this first one deals with the possibility that Gojo maybe wasn't gone yet, and his brain has been transplanted into Yuta's body, and they are currently trying to stitch that back up. Now, I won't say this is impossible, but I don't think this is likely for two reasons. The first one being that I think Gojo has passed away. I think he was deceased, because if he wasn't, I think with that team of doctors and the curse techniques they had there, he could have amped him enough to be able to heal his own body, and they wouldn't have required Akotsu to swap on over to do the RCT, because Gojo is capable of everything Akotsu is, right? So I think Gojo had fully passed away, and that's why they enacted this plan. But then for the second part of it is could they have put Gojo's brain into Akotsu's body? I don't think that would have worked, just because the only way that works with Yuta in Gojo's body is because of Kinjaku's curse technique, right? Which Gojo's brain wouldn't have to help him assimilate into Yuta's body. That would fully just be Shoko performing a brain transplant, which I think is out of her wheelhouse, out of her realm of expertise. And then for your second question here about this way for Gojo to potentially return after Akotsu's 5 minutes are up, I do agree that there is a window there for Gojo to return, but I disagree that it will be via the seance technique, aka the grandma's technique that she used to bring Toji back in Shibuya. Just because Akotsu was nowhere around when that happened, so it would feel really out of left field if he had somehow copied that technique, in my opinion. And yes, Ino has a similar technique in that they are both kind of mediums, but Ino's technique has never been shown to do anything similar to what that grandma did. So I don't expect there to be seance involved, and that's what brings Gojo's soul back. But again, I do think there is a window for Gojo to come back like you're mentioning here. I just think it would happen differently. Next up, we got a couple questions from Jay. The first one being, can Yuta copy Gojo's soul? And I'm going to kind of cite back to my previous answer here, just in that I think if Gojo does have a resurgence, has a moment, then there's already been enough to establish why that was possible via the soul-body-mind connection in JJK, right? Again, citing back to when Geto choked Kinjaku in Shibuya. I think that's enough, and we don't need Gege to throw anything new into the mix to explain it via him having copied the seance technique like in the last question, or here having to gained an ability to copy the soul. Is it impossible? No, but I just don't think it's necessary. For your second question, will Sukuna's domain binding vow be his undoing versus Yuta? And I don't know, I'm interested to see where this goes because I think Yuta is going to fail. If you've seen my previous analysis on this chapter, you'll know where I'm coming from, but this is Yuji's fight to end. And that's not to say that Yuta can't win the domain clash, but I just don't think that will be the end of Sukuna if he does. And what's interesting is, at the end of the chapter, the narrator said that Gojo had figured out a way to defeat Sukuna's open barrier, right? And Yuta now knows that thanks to his access to Gojo's memories. So Yuta, at least in his own mind, has a key here that he is planning to use. Now, that seemingly doesn't have anything to do with the binding vows that Sukuna has made, but we really don't know yet. Plus, those binding vows do keep piling up, so it would be interesting to see that kind of falter at some point for him as well. In any case, though, I do ultimately expect Yuta to fail, so he might not even win the domain clash for all we know. And we do definitely have that merger hanging in the air, which I fully expect to happen. So I'm just excited to see where this goes. Next up, we got this question / kind of theory from Dustin. Let me move out of the way for anybody that wants to pause and read it. But he's ultimately asking if I think that Gojo / Yuta will kind of have this poetic mirrored end to Kinjaku, and that is by getting his head lopped off. And I think it's certainly possible. That would be poetic in a way, and like I did just explain, I do expect Yuta to lose. So whether or not Gege wants to ultimately parallel that directly, I don't know. Next up, we got this question from I've Been Robbed, who wants to know why Yuta has the scar. Because those of you that are unaware, we actually found out from the JJK fan book that Kenjaku had that scar due to a binding vow, but we don't know what the binding vow was. So my best guess is that that binding vow is basically integral to facilitating the technique insofar as we understand it. Maybe he needs that to gain the memories. Maybe he needs that to gain mastery over the techniques. I don't know. Like, it might not be that at all, but whatever we do know is that both of them have now used it, so it seems to be a major key in actually getting what you want to happen with this swap. So I would assume that's why Yuta has it as well. But yeah, it's not based on his inability to heal or anything like that. And speaking of things Yuta copied from Kinjaku, Mr. Bluesky wants to know if Yuta would also have cursed spirit manipulation and idol transfiguration as well. And yes, I do think Yuta would have presumably copied all of the curse techniques Kinjaku had access to, which would include cursed spirit manipulation. However, I don't think that includes idol transfiguration, because Kinjaku didn't have that from body swapping like he did with his other techniques. He had that from extracting it via maximum Uzumaki, which presumably only gives you a one-time use of the technique. So Yuta shouldn't have access to idol transfiguration. But cursed spirit manipulation? Yeah, possibly. But then this brings into the whole question of how is this operating during this 5 minutes of body swap? We don't really know. So does he still have access to everything else too? If so, great. And maybe we'll get to see Yuta do all sorts of crazy stuff, but we're just going to have to wait and see. And speaking of that craziness, Zerings wants to know if I can explain why Yuta has the possibility of losing his curse technique. We know the curse techniques are stored in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, so since it's Yuta's brain, he should have his copy, right? Well, that's what you would think, but Kinjaku's technique is just weird, right? Because we know he not only has his original technique and the technique of the person whose body he's in, but presumably his brain is in their body. So if the technique is only stored in the brain, he shouldn't have access to it, right? But it's also engraved on the body, so that's why he does. But then, more interestingly, he has techniques of people's whose brain he doesn't have and whose body he's not in. Like Yuji's mother, he still has anti-gravity. So there's something about how Kinjaku's technique works that's slightly different than how we normally understand things to function. So because of that, there's just this massive uncertainty with what's going to happen to Yuta after those 5 minutes are done. He could just end up in Gojo's body with only Gojo's stuff after that's over, but we just don't know. And speaking of just the weird, unique stuff with Kinjaku's curse technique, we have this question from Colby, who wants to know why Yuta is using Infinite Void. Shouldn't he still be using his own domain expansion even in Gojo's body? Since, like we've seen with Sukuna, for example, his domain both in Yuji's body, in Megami's body, and presumably his own original body were all malevolent shrines. So how is Yuta using Infinite Void? And I think we can chalk this up to something unique about how this body swap operates. I know a lot of people have also speculated that since Yuta is using Infinite Void, then that means the domain we saw Kinjaku use in his fight against Yuki must have been Geto's domain expansion. And that's certainly possible, but I don't think we have enough information to say that it's for sure what's going on, because for all we know, maybe Akotsu could have cast his own domain if he wanted to, but he chose to cast Gojo's. Like maybe he can cast either of them, right? And maybe Kinjaku could have cast any of the domains of the bodies he's possessed. We just don't know. So it may be that because of how Kinjaku's curse technique works, he has to cast the domain of the body he's in, or he may have an option. And considering the narrator told us that Gojo figured out something about how to defeat Sukuna's barrier, then that could be the reason Yuta would choose to do Gojo's domain, even if he could do his own. Also, Gojo is just built different, right? So he would probably want to choose Gojo's anyway. But really, we don't have enough information yet. But for now, I think we can just chalk this up to a function of the body swap curse technique. And then next up from Sam, we got a few questions. Let me move out of the way. But for these first two, I just addressed this in the previous answer. For your next question down here on how the heck did Gojo and Geto think they could defeat Tengen back in Hidden Inventory if they were going to help Rico? And I think we can just chalk that up to hubris, right? They were the strongest. They were untouchable. I think that they just thought they could handle this ancient sorcerer that was a recluse and just shut in, maintained barriers all day. Next up, we got this question from EXO, who wants to know what I think about chapter 249 when Kenny said his fun isn't over and now he'll have more fun with Yuta and Rika. And I think we have a translation thing going on here, because in the big fan translations, it isn't phrased that way where Kenny says his fun isn't over and that he will have more fun with Yuta and Rika. He's saying like he had fun in his final fight with Takaba, and now it's Rika and Yuta's turn. Like they're about to have fun with what they're going to have to do, presumably fighting Sukuna and the merger and whatever else, right? I don't think the implication in his language there was that he was going to have more fun with them. But that being said, like I've mentioned, I do think there is a path for Kinjaku to show up again. I just don't think that that specific verbiage right there was necessarily alluding to it. Next up, Josue wants to know what character do you think would gain the most if they were to get the 6 eyes? And it's got to be Sukuna. Even though he's already the peak, just imagine what he would be if he had the 6 eyes. He would have the battle IQ, the finesse to wield them potently, and we already know that he has double the amount of cursed energy of Akotsu. So just imagine if he had Gojo's efficiency on top of that. Literally unbeatable. And could Kinjaku transplant his brain into a cursed spirit? I don't think so, just because of the physiological differences between humans and cursed spirits that have been touched on at numerous times. You know, Gojo's unlimited void affects them differently. We know that Sukuna cannot incarnate in a cursed spirit. So similarly, I don't think Kinjaku could use his technique on one. Next, Capital wants to know if Sukuna might eat Yuta/Gojo, and that would be such a gut punch. But as you guys know, I have been waiting for Sukuna to consume somebody, so especially considering Yuta ate the last finger, presumably, this could be on the table. And then finally, y'all, a couple of questions from my JJK predictions I've gotten right video. First, Neck wants me to make a video of everything I've gotten wrong. And I'm not shying away from this, but this is hard to do because most things that I've gotten wrong, we won't know until the manga ends. I've made a lot of predictions, you know, one being I thought Sukuna would eat somebody. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. The main things I've gotten wrong, I already talked about in what I got right, talking about how the things I got right, I even got parts of those wrong. So at the end of the manga, maybe we could revisit this. And finally, Zach wanted to know what my oh shit moment in JJK was where I just wasn't expecting the twist. And two things instantly came to mind for me when I read this. The first one was Junpei's death. I think that caught a lot of people off guard, especially that watched via the anime, which I first found JJK through season 1 of the anime. And him being in the freaking opening, you know, you're like expecting him to become one part of the crew and everything. And then he's just gone. So that was the first one. And then the second one was from the manga when I started reading that. And it was the moment where Sukuna switches changes from Yuji to Megami. That was just all time. That's all for this one. Thank you for the support. Thank you so much for watching. And it's break week, so come hang out in the Discord.